Welcome back, everybody. We're ready to resume. I think I'm just looking through my list of attendees, and I'm not sure that we've got Mr. Fuller there. I don't think we have. It's probably unwise to assume he doesn't want to present legal submissions. Here he comes. All right, thank you. We're ready to go. Thank you, Mr. Fuller. We're in your hands.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could I just inquire, please, has the Zoom link been posted on the website? We noticed yesterday that it seems to be coming up late, and my witnesses may be struggling to join if they're remote. Has it come up right?
I think the general, I mean, yes, they are. I don't know whether they have been posted or not, but the link should have been sent to you and your team, and you're perfectly at liberty to send them that so that they can just click on an email.
My understanding was when I tried to send it, it doesn't necessarily become live for them. That was the case. Yeah. Mr. Pryor saying he couldn't open it when I said it wasn't live.
Really?
When you forward things, sometimes they're not live.
Okay. Well, I'll inquire. Where's Mr. Bell? Is he there?
No, it's me, Phil. I'll look it up now. Just give me a couple of minutes.
Yes, the team have been relying on the general posted link, but it was a bit late going up yesterday, apparently.
Morning one's there, I see, but it doesn't look like the afternoon one is. Just refreshing the screen and seeing if it makes any difference. No, this morning one's there, but this afternoon one appears not to be.
That's what I've been finding, Mr. Chair. I see Mr. Thompson seems to have been able to join, but
yes, have I.
Yeah, I'm a bit. Yeah, we won't cast any aspersions on anyone's technical ability with Zoom, just in case we get it wrong. There's Mr. Hartley, he's there.
Okay, so it's not up, you're quite correct, but we rely on our communications team to be able to do this. So I've just sent them an email asking them to do it as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think let's start and we'll see how we go. So just when you're ready, Mr. Fuller, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to introduce within the room, I don't have sort of a widescreen camera, but I do have Mr. Pryor and Mr. McCowan and Mr. Goodwin. So they're both, they're all here with me, but the others are joining remotely. So I'm not sure how you'd like me to proceed, but I do suggest that maybe I address the legal submissions from the council this morning about CABRA. Is that before I launch into my submissions, or what would you prefer, Mr. Chair?
Well, we're in your hands. We've read, the same drill as we've said all the way through. We have read your submissions, so we don't need you to read those. We're keen to understand points of contention and what you want us to do about them. So whatever suits you best. I would have thought the CABRA decision's a pretty good starting point, though, but over to you.
Very good. And if I just maybe jump straight to the conclusion from counsel for the council at paragraph 20, if we've got access to those.
Yes.
In her conclusion, she states the CABRA decisions are not binding on the panel and do not set a precedent. Now, obviously words and language are very important in these proceedings, and with respect, I never used the word binding or bound. You're welcome to go and do a search on my submissions, but I haven't used that terminology. And the reason for that is quite clear, that there's two forms of legal precedent. One is in fact binding, the other is persuasive. and I'm sure Mr. Cooney will understand what I'm saying there. And as legal counsel, I certainly have sought to persuade the panel of the relevance and the importance of the Cabra decision, but I have refrained from saying that they are in fact bound by it. If that's the impression that's been gained, that certainly wasn't the intention, and I may have sailed close to the wind as counsel, but I certainly haven't used that term, and I don't imply that. I'm just suggesting that those Cabra decisions, as earlier ones, are very persuasive on this panel in terms of their deliberations.
I think that's the basis on which we've read your submissions and Ms. Parham's. So I don't think there's any issue that you need to dwell on in terms of clarifying that from our point of view. We're not saying, I don't think we're saying that you say that we just have to blindly follow it. You're saying that the information and the facts in that case are sufficiently similar to this one that we should take a similar approach. That's what you're telling us, I think. And I don't think Ms. Parham's saying anything different. She's simply saying that they aren't, by the way, they are not binding on us. And we know that that's the case as well. So I don't think there's anything in that, at least from our point of view.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just, I suppose, a bit wary of a straw man in that regard.
No, that's fine.
Yes, so just moving maybe to the substance, and the panel may or may not be familiar with some of the history of the Cabra case, which I think is relevant. The notified plan from the Auckland Council back in 2013, I think it was, 14, didn't have the provisions that the AUP put in the plan. Some submitters turned up to the hearing and said, we want the Rodney provisions because we like the Rodney provisions and would like them for the whole of the district. So that's not dissimilar to this situation where the notified plan didn't have the extent of the provisions. I think there was some TDR mechanism, but a very limited one. But the objectives, policies and rules were actually something that the panel itself developed and introduced based on effectively the template from Rodney. And so that's important to understand because that's not actually dissimilar here when Middlemiss actually requested effectively the AUP provisions be rolled into this plan, which had been partly obviously part of Franklin district provisions historically. So I think that that's very important to understand that when counsel for the council says there's no objective policy rule framework, effectively what the submitters in Cabra sought was a rollover of what had been in the Rodney plan, and the panel tweaked them and worked on them, but basically agreed after having heard extensive evidence that that was an appropriate approach. The council refused that relief or recommendation from the panel, as it's entitled to do, and that's how the matter ended up in the Environment Court. Went to the High Court on some more technical issues, but the merits weren't disturbed. And the other thing I think that it's important to appreciate is in the Cabra decision, when it's referred to in evidence in the Section 42A report that there was agreement, the council agreed, etc., to TDR, that was the result of mediation. It wasn't that they agreed, they didn't actually want them, but those references from the court were to the agreement that was part of the mediation process. So then just turning to 17, paragraph 17 of the council submissions, there is a difference in terms of the countryside living zone being the recipient in the Auckland area, which is different to Mr. Hartley's approach. But I also understand, and he can expand on that, that the countryside living zones in the Auckland Council area are actually too small and not necessarily in the right locations to receive lots. So if you do adopt that approach, that can be problematic. So in terms of the point B, that's the point that I'd addressed in her submission, that there was a framework in the higher order AUP plan, but it was introduced. So in my submission, it's also within the scope of this panel's jurisdiction to also introduce necessary objectives and policies to provide that framework as per the ones that are in the Auckland plan.
I don't think Ms. Parham's saying there's no scope, is there? She's just saying on the facts, she may have a slightly different opinion, or on the cases and the facts, she has a different opinion. I don't think she's saying we don't have scope to adopt the relief that you're seeking if we were minded to go with that, is she?
She's not saying that, Mr. Chair, but the reporting planner was, and
Yeah,
I didn't
okay.
respond on that. The reporting planner denied that we had scope for TDR.
Yeah, okay. No, that's fine.
So she didn't put comment on that, so that's fair comment.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
So just seeing if there's any other further points just on those submissions. I also think, as an observation, and we don't know what a different court would say, but this panel may or may not be aware, obviously, that Judge Kirkpatrick was the chair of the Unitary Plan Hearings Panel. He's now the Principal Environment Court Judge. He's just ruled on conservation lot provisions in the Thames Coromandel Plan. So he's quite familiar with these processes. And so that has to be, in my view, something that is something to keep in mind with the
Are you also going to remind us that he was ably assisted by other commissioners?
Bit players. But yes, he was, and certainly that's the case. But obviously he was the chair, and he has acted for Rodney, I think, in those councils in the past. So he's very familiar, I think, Mr. Chair, with those types of provisions. And the court did not seem disturbed by any allegations, for example, they're difficult to administer. Now, if I just jump now to, because we are short of time, to the actual evidence from the council, and it's section 42A report, the original one, to reject the TDR mechanism. And I'm not sure if you've got that in front of you, but I'm referring to paragraph 639. Paragraph 639, and you'll recall some of this, but the council officer effectively went and discussed the, I'll just wait for you to find it, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, I've got it.
Yes, if you look at paragraph 639, because it's obviously very important for the panel to understand the technical and evidential basis for the rejection of these provisions. And we can trace that back to that report. And at paragraph 639, it is understood when you look at the preamble that the report writer went and had a chat to some of the regulatory team. And that's some of the feedback that was obtained from the regulatory team about the TDRs. Now, with respect, those people in the regulatory team aren't for this panel. So to some extent, that is hearsay evidence. I'm not saying she has got no familiarity with TDRs, but she obviously is relying on other officers in council for that advice. There's no section 35 analysis of the historical provisions and supposedly why they aren't up to scratch. There's no assessment of the ecological outputs from the previous positions. And with respect, the only witnesses in these proceedings that are familiar with those provisions are the ones that Middlemiss, in a detailed sense in the Auckland area. I'm not sure of Mr. Cleese's working knowledge of the provisions, but certainly in terms of Mr. Hartley, 40 odd years of planning, and Rodney and the other witnesses that we've presented, they are familiar with how these provisions work. And in terms of problems in Franklin, I'm not saying that it was perfect, but Mr. Forrester has already provided evidence to the panel that there is some clues just in the way that they were administered by the council itself. Now, if you go, sir, to paragraph 648 of that same report, it notes that Auckland Council opposes the introduction of TDR provisions. Now, I'm not sure if that's of any assistance at all, bearing in mind the Cabra case and the fact that Auckland Council position was they basically lost on those score. And therefore, again, some of that interaction with Auckland Council staff has to be weighed accordingly. It's hearsay, but also put up against the significant experience of the likes of Mr. Hartley, who obviously wasn't directly involved in these provisions, and Mr. Thompson, who in fact appeared and was involved in the Cabra case. So I would like the panel to just be aware of the level of experience and the basis, which in my submission is quite weak, for this rejection of these provisions. It seems to be mainly some sort of a growth management issue. And on that point, the court was very clear in Cabra that it didn't agree that the Auckland Council was able to use these provisions and reject them on the basis of growth management because of the ecological benefits. It was very focused on those. And in our submission, those certainly can be realised in the Waikato district as well. So just maybe going back to my submissions, that just fleshes out a little bit about the basis for supposedly the reason that these mechanisms aren't able to work. I would like to point out to the panel that in 1.2 of my legal submissions, I've got the three distinguishable in my submission relief, sort of classes of relief being sought. It's very easy, and I see that the focus is very much swung on TDRs, and that's okay, we can discuss those, but we are seeking in situ as well, which, for example, if they're being generated in situ, don't have the same consequences in terms of having to relocate. So I would very much like the panel in its deliberations to appreciate, even though there's a combined table, for example, from Mr. Hartley, that you can actually chop this up a bit if you had to. We don't think that you need to, but that is certainly a point I'd like to make at the outset, because as you see from the evidence of Mr. Thompson, there is some different economics around these different mechanisms as well. And I think Mr. McCowan's experience too is that to some extent in situ can work better from a landowner enhancement perspective. So those are the three streams of relief. I'll just quickly flick through and pick up if there's anything else. I heard the comment this morning from you, sir, that you saw this as just essentially that farmers are often motivated, and Mr. Kessel said that to do the right thing, but they just sometimes can't afford to do so. This is a way of filling in the gap with capital. It's probably at least $50,000 a hectare to do this sort of work with active planting. In my submission, the current provisions as notified and even as modified with is just some small additional plantings, but they still have to be tied to SNAs, will not achieve the no net loss required in the RPS. It will not achieve the corridors that are intended to be provided in the RPS, and I covered those submission points in regard to that policy, which in my submission is quite a critical one. I think it's 11.1 in terms of the RPS and giving effect to it. And that I'll just maybe jump to that. Jumping around a little bit, but I'm just trying to hit the high points. In terms of that policy, is quite a critical one. There's obviously other regional policy statements, policies in terms of integrated management, and you'll see all the points there that the witnesses will address to bringing financial capital issues, regulation, climate change, all of these things together in a very positive, in our submission, outcome for land management. Ecosystem services is another point that we don't consider that the plan currently properly addresses, which is an RPS issue. Certainly the soils issue, we aren't seeking just wholesale subdivision for no benefit. We're not even challenging the 40 hectare rule. We're just saying allow an opportunity for proper enhancement, which requires a significant amount of effort by a landowner to try and redress the balance and the loss of biodiversity in the region. Yes, on page 25 of my submissions, that chapter 11, policy 11.1, again, I sort of focused quite closely, sir, on the words, the recreation and restoration of habitats and connectivity between habitats.
What paragraph was that, Mr. Phillip?
Paragraph 8.14 on page 25 of my legal submissions.
You don't go up to page 25.
Yeah, he does. Yes, he does.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
So what that policy see there is talking about connectivity between habitats, and that's what I would have been good to hear from Mr. Turner about, and I know that you gave Mr. Turner an opportunity to comment, but if you have two SNAs and nothing between them, and it might be several hundred metres, even a kilometre between them, there is significant environmental benefit from connecting those two areas, and they may be in different titles. And that is the sort of thing that Mr. Goodwin can demonstrate has been happening in Rodney. That is a requirement in the RPS, and we just do not see that the current provisions as notified actually achieve that. And C, over the page there on page 26, creating buffers, linkages and corridors to protect and support Indigenous biodiversity. Dr. Keesing has a very clear view that these provisions that we're seeking will in fact meet that policy objective. So that recreation and restoration element for us means not just protecting the status quo, but having a vision for the Waikato district, having even a target as the court endorsed in Cabra of 30-odd% of your ecotones. That's not that every bit of land is going to have that percentage, but as an average across the district, that could be the Waikato in the next 10, 20 years of significantly recreating wetlands, linking isolated SNAs that will not be protected unless there's a development. That's the other thing. That's why we're going backwards. So that this incentive is to actually try and just change that paradigm and create a positive incentive for this work to be done, which is expensive work. So I think that that's probably about all I need to say, I think, at this stage. And we can now go to evidence unless there's any questions. Happy to address those, but otherwise I can introduce the witnesses maybe after the questions.
All right, let's just see if there are any questions. Mr. Fulton.
No, not at this stage, thank you.
Mr. Marg?
No, not from me either.
Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing at this stage, thanks.
Mr. Cooney?
Yeah, thanks. I think the legal position's been clarified. So thanks for that, and Ms. Parham's help as well. So we're pretty clear on where we stand in that regard. Just on the in situ situation which you're advocating for as well, the real distinction between what you're seeking and what the conservation lot provision allows is that you want to be able to create these areas within the in situ situation. That's the main add-on to that?
That's correct. And I suppose we're using as a template Tiriti Mātangi, the significant ecological outcome there, which was, I mean, it had, I think it was down to 15, 12% or so of vegetation left. It was basically disgraced. And you've got Takahei, and I don't know if you've been out there, but it's a fantastic example of what we can do as co-creators, you might say. I mean, there's been a lot of negativity about our influence. I'm familiar with the Whangarei area, that's my Turanga Waiwai. And at Bream Head, all that coast up there, there's numerous land care groups, and people are really getting a buzz out of going out and basically smashing stakes and possums and planting trees. And they've had a significant increase in kiwi habitat. Now, a lot of that's on the back of change of land use away from pastoral farming, subdivision, people retiring there with a bit of time and energy. There's a lot of iwi initiatives as well. This is a job-rich area. You have people growing plants, people planting plants, people doing pest control. A development I'm familiar with up there, the first 4 years of pest control on this development will be $75,000 worth of work. That's just pest control. That's been required to be undertaken. So there was a discussion with Mr. Forrester about how you ensure these things happen. Absolutely. Covenants, penalties, bonds, they're all tools that can be used to make sure that the work is actually done.
Yeah, so I've seen them work in the past.
Yes.
Just on that, we're in a difficult position in some ways because, and that's our job to make the hard decisions. But we've got a policy which seems to come through. The policy direction that has been promoted under this new plan is to protect the productive rural land and use it for production purposes, and try and manage better the creation of lifestyle blocks within the rural area. How do we, if we open the door too much on that policy direction, then it's going to defeat that direction. How do we reach a balance in your view? I know that's ultimately our difficult decision, but what do you say about that? Because that's the concern raised by the 42A authors.
Yes, and for a start, we don't disagree with primary production. I mean, Steve's a farmer, and we support primary production, but we don't see it as being and instead of, we see it as being and as well as. Even on your horticultural blocks that are got elite soils, you have waterways that still need protecting. You often will have, on those blocks, have soil that's not elite. You might have a pocket, and that's where you might be able to put a house. We don't disagree, and we don't say that every block with elite soils is going to be able to necessarily have this type of subdivision. That will be part of the assessment process. But we do think that for ecosystem services and for primary production, water quality, a whole lot of other reasons, that this is an opportunity that should be in the plan, and it will vary across different areas. There's obviously some parts where the soils aren't such good quality and there's steep gullies and things. It's not so much of an issue, and they might have more opportunity. But it is a fine balance, and perfection will not be achieved. I think that's quite clear to everybody, and it may need tweaking over time. But we do see that this method is compatible with also maintaining rural production through design, and the witnesses can help flesh that out a little bit for the panel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Kearney. And I have no questions, thanks, Mr. Fuller. So let's get into the witnesses.
Yeah, so we had, just to recall, we did have the Webbers earlier in the opening hearings, just the people from South Kaikoura Head. I just wanted to remind the panel that they had the little video, etc. They are now on the biodiversity website as exemplars. And what I've said there, that they wouldn't have been able to do their work but for the opportunity under the Rodney plan. So that's what we're just seeking here, is that more of that work can take place. So I'll call Mr. McCowan. He's going to just slide in front of Mr. Pryor's computer.
Thank you.
So he's got a summary statement, and we'll be open for questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much.
This meeting is being
If you start talking, Steve, you'll come up.
Good afternoon to the chair and the panel.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, I was looking at the wrong screen. There you are. Yes, good afternoon.
My name's Steve McCowan. We've got...
yeah, can you mute your mic?
Sorry. No, it's still going.
And the volume right down. Sorry, we're just adjusting computers here.
Excellent. My name's Steve McCowan. I'm a qualified ag professional and have been operating in the rural sector for the last 35 odd years. We've been involved in not only consultancy work and valuation work, but also farmland ownership in that time. And we're currently involved in a large farm at Nahanapuri called Drumley. And we're also involved with Murimas Farm Holdings Limited, which is located at 95 Jericho Road in Pukikoe East. And over the years, we've been involved in a number of enhancement planting programs and the resulting subdivisions within the Rodney district. And more recently, we've been implementing the enhancement planting at 95 Jericho Road. And that's based under the legacy Franklin rules that's referred to in the evidence of Mr. Pryor. I've outlined in my evidence the concerns that I've got for the future of New Zealand's rural economic success, given the present path the New Zealand rural sector has been forced down, and how we might change this course. Today's rural landscape and the new and proposed rules we as farmers have to operate under are very different to what we had 3 years ago. So much so that many of us, as farmers of the land, feel that the world is against us because we are now seen as polluters of the environment and responsible for climate change. A lot of farmers are also struggling to survive financially, given the extreme seasons that we've had recently, and the poor financial performance from the likes of Fonterra. On top of that, we've had continued farm expenses lifting and added costs as a result of the new rules and laws that are coming through. On top of this, at present, we've got a government that isn't following the covenants in the Paris Accord, as was agreed with regard to the condition that it must not affect food production with its climate change policies. Fonterra has recently signalled to us as suppliers and shareholders that it no longer sees its milk supply increasing due to the environmental pressures coming on its suppliers. COVID-19's arrived and will likely continue to change where and how New Zealanders want to live and work. This is likely to be in a safer, less populated rural environment for those that can afford to do so. And already, excuse me, already we're seeing that that pressure coming on the lifestyle block market in the areas that we are based in. Murimas Farm Holdings is detailed in its submission a win-win strategy for council and the panel to consider. And if this is accepted, we will see the flow of benefits to all of New Zealand as well as our natural ecosystems. The recent ruling by the Environment Court Judge J.A. Smith in the Canberra versus Auckland Council case is clearly sided with the protection and enhancement of our environment and has provided significant environmental area, wetland and revegetation incentives so that landowners are properly enabled to restore New Zealand's natural landscapes. The cost of enhancement and re-veg planting, including weed control infrastructure requirements, fencing, etc., are more or less the same on a per hectare basis for each region of New Zealand. The Waikato district is different to Auckland Council's area due to less population pressure at the moment, resulting in lower land values and site values. This in turn means that Waikato farmers could not justify the cost to revegetate if Waikato District Council used the Auckland Unitary Plan's revegetation rules as they now stand. For this process to be economically viable and therefore successful throughout the whole of the Waikato district, the yield threshold areas and provisions for transferable or in situ site titles will need to be adjusted from the Auckland numbers. From an environmental point of view, the key is that all farms in the Waikato region can equally participate in this incentive process over the next 10 to 20 to 50 years. In Rodney, we've seen a massive change in terms of the environmental work that's been completed in the last 20 to 25 years. And where we live, we're now seeing neighbours put out field cams, or the little portable cameras you tie to a tree. And last week, one of them took a photo of a kiwi in bush that has been recently planted over the last 20 years. So to see that sort of change in the bird life is pretty amazing. And this area is not fenced off like the regional parks are, such as Tawhanui. So to see the birds come back into that environment is very, very encouraging. Even if a profit's not able to be made by the landowner, the method and the relief being sought will at least reduce the losses from undertaking the enhancement work, motivated either by good stewardship of the farmer and or the force of regulation, e.g. to meet the water quality standards. There will need to be sound future planning to cater for the production of TDRs, making sure that this market remains fluid so that farmers in the outer regions have the ability to reduce their financial risk as quickly as possible. The better this is managed, then the faster we will be able to restore our natural ecosystems, slowing down environmental damage, and the sooner the bankers will have the confidence to finance this type of investment. The option we've presented in our submission is a win-win for all parties, with the environment and our future generations reaping the most benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCowan. Let's see if the panel's got any questions for you. Ms. Gibb?
No questions at this stage, thanks.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just a couple of questions, Mr. McGowan. From my understanding of this is, first of all, you either have to do one or two things. You either have to have a great interest in the revegetation and the enhancement of the area, or you take a business approach and just say, there's an economic value in this to me to enhance my returns by doing it. So there's two aspects, isn't it? You've got some farmers who will do it because they wish to, and because they think it's the right thing to do and they enjoy it, and they have an interest, and the other ones will take it as a business case and present it that way. Is that a fair assessment?
It's fair, but things are changing at the moment with the new rules coming through in terms of, for example, the setback required with our drains, streams and creeks. That's all starting to become very costly. And if I give you a simple example, with our farm at Nahinapuri, which is 340 odd hectares that we milk cows on, we have about 38 kilometres of drains and streams, and the cost of moving the one-wire fences out that 3 metre spacing, and in some cases it will have to go out to 5 metres on our where our main streams are located. The cost to Drumley is very fast approaching that $700,000 to $900,000 capital costs that we'll have to fund at some stage in the future. If we can go, and obviously Drumley's in Waipa, but the same applies for any farm in the Waikato district, such as our farm at Jericho Road. If we're incentivized to do this sort of work, whereas at the moment, to me as a farmer and as a consultant, it feels like this is the cost of our license to continue to farm, which I don't think is fair considering the history of the rural sector and just how valuable it is for New Zealand's future. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Mr. Marg, any questions? Any questions from you, Mr. Marg?
Apologies, no, not at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kearney.
No, just an observation. We've got two people with farming backgrounds sitting with us as commissioners. So I just make that point.
Thanks, Mr. McCown. I don't have any questions. I think your evidence is clear. I don't have anything to seek clarification on, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Steve. We'll now move on to Dr. Keesing. Hopefully he's able to be brought on screen from somewhere.
Hopefully you can all hear me.
Yes.
Good. Okay. So just a bit of background. I have been involved in conservation lot surveys and assessments since 2000 in the Frankland and in the Western Bay and Plenty, and a few in the Waikato district, not so many, but I've done several hundred in the Franklin district, just as by way of understanding my experience in this. My evidence in chief relates to the loss and remains of Indigenous biodiversity in the region. I relate that the Indigenous biodiversity, as you probably already know, is very underrepresented at less than 11% in the region. There's not much left. And what is left tends to be in either two situations. It's either relatively stable large tracts of reserve in DOC or council lands, or small vulnerable fragments throughout private land. Small sites, and those not quite good enough to meet the S&A criteria, are still valuable. And they often have threatened species in them, and they make up a large component of the remnant Indigenous biodiversity. As some of the S&A material that you may have read will tell you, Kessel's crew found about 1,600 sites which were not quite S&As, and around 700 sites which were S&As. So you can see that a large number of the fragments throughout private landscape still have Indigenous biodiversity, but are not S&A, most of them. Indigenous biodiversity restoration has value and is successful, but it is very expensive and it is ongoing. The current biodiversity documentation out of Department of Conservation, the strategy, will tell you that it's no longer habitat loss by active clearance that is the main issue. It is pests. It is the continued gnawing away at the values by mammalian pests and by plant pests in the main, but also insect pests. The essence of my evidence is that this plan, to me, is an old approach to Indigenous biodiversity, and it fails to enable sufficiently incentivisation of conservation and restoration. The planner in the section 42A references a conservation lot as a method to attain development, and that development appears the focus of the process. I see it the other way. Today, the populace have a direction, and it's a very big flavour at the moment, to improve Indigenous biodiversity, and they need a means to do that. Now, we heard earlier from one of the panel that there are two types of approaches. One is people out of the goodness of their heart desire, want to do it, and the other is for business. In either way, it's expensive, and to do it properly, you need money, and you need to get money from somewhere. And rather than seeing that limitation on development in the landscape, you need to think of it more as where is the opportunity to increase biodiversity and not also take away from productive land. I think that should be the flavour. But it is not enough to only protect S&A. If the plan, as it states, is to maintain or enhance the Indigenous biodiversity in the landscape, you cannot just protect S&A. As I've already said, there are many other fragments and areas of Indigenous biodiversity that don't currently meet the S&A, and without which S&A, Indigenous biodiversity would probably halve in the landscape. So, as I say, there are numerous not quite S&As and two small S&As which wouldn't meet the size criteria that could be S&A in the future if they were restored. There are almost no good incentives in the current plan to save these many features that are not S&A. And the cost of restoration and ongoing management is considerable. The plan as drafted, I don't believe, provides the correct incentives. I think there are 4 steps it could do to improve this. The first is to make smaller limits on Indigenous biodiversity that are required to form a lot or whatever it is. And on one we've already heard from, and Mr. Turner agrees with me, that the wetland provisions should drop down to half a hectare, not 1 hectare. In saying that, I'll note to you too that the new NPS for fresh water points to councils recognising 0.05 of a hectare as valuable wetlands. So we're already still a lot bigger than the national policy statement suggests we should be looking at wetlands. The other thing is that there shouldn't be a limit on the number of lots. If the Indigenous biodiversity that's being protected is sufficiently large, then that's the valuable piece, not the number of lots. Now I understand there are issues around managing people in subdivision and landscapes, but surely that's possible. The third one is that it should allow other things than just SNAs. Otherwise, you are not going to maintain, and you are certainly not going to enhance Indigenous biodiversity. And the last thing is that I am a firm believer in TDRs, because while it's sometimes appropriate to have people in that landscape where the ecological value is, often it's not. And there needs to be a way to shift, while still attaining the benefits of that money to develop the Indigenous biodiversity, there needs to be a way to shift them out. That's me in a nutshell.
Sorry, I muted myself inadvertently. Let's just see if there's any questions. Can we start with you, please, Ms. Gibb?
Yes, and thank you. No questions, but thinking through the cost of doing any of this work, it's also the time involved, especially if the owner is a farmer working on the farm. A lot of time is involved in all of what you're suggesting, which is a disincentive. So yeah, I listened very carefully, and I do understand the idealistic view of this. It's the practicalities that need to be addressed, I think. Thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
And I have no questions.
Mr. Marg?
Yeah, I don't really have a question, more of an observation that, you know, I applaud what you're trying to achieve, but it's a costly, expensive exercise in relationship to the farmer themselves, as you say. Yeah, I guess we'll see how things turn out.
Thanks, Mr. Marg. Mr. Cooney?
Yeah, Mr. Kissing, what's the costs run out if you wanted to develop a, say, 5 hectare vegetation riparian margin planting? What are we looking at? So let's take 5 hectares.
5 hectares from a fairly unplanted situation, you're probably looking in the vicinity of $300,000 or $400,000. So Peter was quite right in that it is roughly $50,000 per hectare to restore from a general pasture situation. That's a cheap one.
Okay. And of course, the 1 hectare wetland would be much less than that.
It's about 20 or 30.
20, yeah, okay. Thank you.
Just one from me, Dr. Keesing. Obviously, transferable titles is one way of raising money to undertake the sorts of work that you're talking about. Elsewhere in New Zealand, what mechanisms are used and how much money is available for these sorts of work?
Some of the regional councils offer seed money or fencing money or other financial support. It's not usually much. It can get something started, and then people have to often require other, sometimes government, sometimes DOC funds. They are not much and they're contested, so you have to be one of the lucky few. There are not many ways that actually deliver you sufficient money.
And I suppose one that arises from that, what would you say to the proposition, and it's not my proposition, but I put it to you because I think it's fair to say that if society values biodiversity, then society, rather than flogging off sections, is the more appropriate way of of doing that. And I don't mean the question to be pejorative. I'm just trying to express it
I
colloquially.
absolutely agree. If you were a farmer and you had a bush block on it, and I don't see why it's your responsibility to protect it and enhance it at all. Communities should recognise that, and they should do it. I totally agree. It's not the way it happens, though.
No, understand. And I would have thought that's one of the problems, and that, you know, central government talks a big game in terms of lofty objectives. Then's got very short arms and long pockets when it comes to funding it.
Very much so. It's even compounded when a council recognises an SNA and then prohibits a range of activities and yet still gives no relief. That's even worse.
All right, no, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I suppose you raised the interesting issue of effectively public money being used on private land, which is always a bit of a tough one to sell in Wellington, I think. And I suppose just something that hasn't quite come up is that to put a fence around an SNA and even covenant it and do pest control is a lot less expensive than actually doing the stuff from scratch or re-establishing. So the rules actually support the former, not the latter, but the money biggest money is actually required for the latter, which is another interesting little observation. But thanks for that. Mr. Goodwin, I'll just rotate the computer a little bit, and Mr. Goodwin will come on screen. And he'll go through his summary.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and the panel.
Good afternoon.
Hi. So just going through my summary. So my qualifications and experience were as outlined in my primary evidence. I've done a lot of work in the Rodney district using the Rodney plans over the last 20 years. My evidence regarding practical examples in the Rodney area of the ecological benefits of enhancement subdivision, and it makes the following findings. That the Auckland Council rules, including the legacy in the previous Rodney district plan rules, that relate to creating titles from protecting areas of bush and wetland and planting bush, have in my view been very successful in achieving that and creating protected natural areas. The rules have resulted in the creation of a very large number of covenants across the region, protecting large areas of significant bush and wetlands and large areas of replanted bush as well, that a lot of it's now 15 years old, and you're going and looking at it and seeing it's come away really well. Ecological linkages are now being created due to covenants on one property adjoining covenants on another. This is starting to create significant corridors of protected land, often along wetlands and gully systems, or across steeper slopes covered in remnant or regenerating native bush, as features like that often tend to cross multiple properties. Some of these corridors and covenant areas are shown on the maps that were appended in my primary evidence. The accumulating linkages and the resulting expanded continuous protected areas result in much greater ecological resilience of the expanded area compared to just protecting isolated areas. The rules have only been in place for about 25 years in relation to, getting titles as a result of protecting and planting natural areas, which ecologically is a very short time frame. So over time, I would expect to see that network continue to expand if the rules continue to provide for this, as it looks as though they will with the new plan rules. The effects on rural productivity are generally low, as most planted or protected areas tend to go on steeper slopes or on lower quality grazing land, such as wetlands. And the Auckland plan rules also direct planting and the placement of the new titles away from their prime or elite soils. Right, thank you.
I think that is the new gold star standard for summary, Mr. Goodwin. Thank you for being succinct. Which is not to say we want people to skim over things quickly. I say that a little bit facetiously, but it's a very helpful summary. Thank you. Let's see if there's any questions. Mr. Marg?
No, none for me, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I don't have any questions.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
No, thank you.
And I don't think I have any questions either. I think it's very clear. Thank you. Thanks for your evidence.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And now I'll call upon Mr. Thompson, who's hopefully somewhere in the electronic ether.
There he is. We can see him.
Thank you, Mr. Fuller. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and panel. Hopefully you can hear me well. I'm actually from the beach house, and just let me know if the signal's not coming through strongly. I can perhaps turn the video off if that helps.
So far, so good. Thank you.
Excellent. I do have a summary statement which I'll run through if you have that available.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so start at paragraph 1. I expect the historic trend of an increase of around 200 lifestyle or rural households per annum to continue in the Waikato district. So that's the long-term historic rate of life, bearing in mind that there's potential for over 10,000 lifestyle blocks based on the council's estimates to be created. So that's around 50 years worth of supply. So really there's unconstrained supply of lifestyle blocks. So to me, that's an important economic context to consider this policy proposal with them. Just carry on. The TDR policy and rules proposed by Middle Mist would encourage subdivision on less productive soils compared with the proposed Waikato district policy of allowing subdivision on child sites with up to 20% high quality soils. So that's one of the main benefits I see from an economic perspective, is you are incentivizing development of lots on land that's not of high quality. Para 2. I estimate that 1/3 of rural subdivision will occur on high quality soils if the section 42A recommended provisions are approved. There would be notably fewer lifestyle blocks created on land with high class soils if the Middle Mist submission relief is approved. So that's a broad estimate. There's actually no good information on how many lifestyle blocks would occur on land that is of high quality, but approximately 1/3 I think is a reasonable assumption. Paragraph 3, a TDR policy allows for revegetation of lower productivity land and provides indirect and passive benefits through the provision of ecosystem services. These benefits are estimated to have a value in the order of 2,600 per hectare annually. As an example, the 1 hectare lifestyle lot providing 5 hectares of revegetation would generate $13,000 of ecosystem service benefits annually, or $179,000 in terms of net present value over 30 years at a discount rate of 6%. If a quarter of new lifestyle blocks created over the next decade are as a result of TDR, 89 million. So that's a significant economic benefit to weigh up. The net present value of the construction and operation of new lifestyle blocks represents a significant contribution to the Waikato district economy. Over a 10-year period, the net present value is 1.121 million. That should actually say, million. Over a 20-year period, this increases to 2,385 million, and over a 40-year period, this increases to 4,714 million. In broad terms, the economic value of enabling 200 lifestyle blocks per annum over the 20 to 30 years is in the order of 2 to 3 billion. This is a significant economic benefit and will also create opportunities for employment to be provided regarding the requirements of section 32(2)A, I and 2, 1 and 2 of the Act. The cost of removing agricultural land is estimated by Dr. Fairgrave to be between 51 million and 102 million in net present value terms, plus an additional 20% negative indirect effects, e.g. reduced agricultural processing. He calculated that this would be a total negative impact of 61 million to 122 million net present value. For the reasons outlined in my primary evidence, I believe this estimate is incorrect and the net present value is in the order of -3 million to -7 million. This is a minor cost compared to the significant benefits outlined above regarding the quantification of benefits and costs as per section 32 and the net position. Paragraph 6. I have reviewed the summary evidence of Mr. Steve McCowan in respect of the development costs and revenues of lot subdivision and TDR creation from different revegetation options. This provides a useful basis to determine the types of development that are feasible in the marketplace under various policies, and in particular the quantity of hectares of revegetation that would enable each to be feasible. The table below shows the summary results from this assessment. Lots that cost up to $350,000 to produce are feasible, as shown in green, and therefore are likely to proceed in the marketplace based on average lot sale values in the Waikato. TDRs that cost up to $130,000 to produce are feasible, as shown in green, and are also likely to proceed in the marketplace. So the difference in value there is essentially because you can create a TDR, one of the more expensive mechanisms, and obviously if you take one of the other pathways to create a TDR, you can do it less expensively, and that sets the price. It does create a challenge for revegetation as a way of creating a TDR. So paragraph 8, there are several important implications from these calculations. Riparian in situ lots created on up to 3 hectares of planting are feasible. However, riparian TDRs are not feasible. Bush lots created in situ on up to 3 hectares of planting are feasible. However, bush TDRs are not feasible. Natural revegetation in situ lots of 10 hectares are feasible. However, TDRs are not feasible. Wetland lots created in situ of up to 4 hectares of planting are feasible. However, wetland TDRs of up to only 2 hectares are feasible. Paragraph 9 just runs through what I just explained in terms of the difference of the cost here. So I'll jump down to paragraph 10. The policy implication is that TDRs created through revegetation are only feasible with fewer hectares when compared to lots created through revegetation in situ. And this is a central consideration for this policy. In broad terms, for the method to be effective, i.e. for applications to be large, revegetation lots should require no more than 3 hectares of planting, and TDR lots should require no more than 1 hectare of planting, with the exception of natural revegetation, which is 10 hectares for lots and around 5 hectares for TDRs. It's important to distinguish the Waikato from the coastal parts of Rodney in terms of the value of lots created under enhancement provisions. And as recently settled in AUP Cabra 2020 Environment Court decision, provided in Appendix C. I was involved in these proceedings in setting the areas to be protected and enhanced in the AUP appeals. Because the lot values in coastal Rodney were expected to be in the 400 to 500,000 range, the areas could be larger and the projects would still be viable. So when you get a higher sale price, obviously that enables more expenditure and the project is still viable. At the generally lower values for lots in the Waikato, it is location dependent. The areas need to be smaller for the TDR and in situ enhancement methods to be implemented. The following figure shows the land value of livestock blocks across the district. Locations that have livestock blocks of 350,000 or greater, shown in light green to red, will be feasible in respect of the analysis in Table 1 and can be expected to occur in the market. As shown in Figure 1, livestock blocks tend to have a higher land value surrounding Hamilton and near the southern border of Auckland, as well as near Raglan. So just concentration of orange and yellow dots around Hamilton City and the southern periphery of Auckland, and also to the west. Also worth noting, the distribution of new lifestyle blocks is quite widespread, aside from those concentrations. Paragraph 14, the Middlemist submission relief would not generally result in any additional lifestyle blocks being created in the Waikato district. However, it would result in fewer lifestyle blocks being created on land that has high-class soils. The Middlemist proposed rules would therefore result in a net economic benefit that is greater than the Waikato district policy recommendations, and in my opinion, best satisfies the analysis required under Section 32 of the Act, opportunities for employment and economic growth, and cost-benefit assessment. I've reviewed Dr. Fairgrave's supplementary statement dated 16 September. I make the following brief comments in response. Dr. Fairgrave correctly points out the difference between calculating GDP via the expenditure approach and the value added approach. The expenditure approach is calculated by summing all the transactions of final goods that occur within an economy over a set period of time. The value added approach involves summing the value added at each stage of the production process. The two approaches are roughly equivalent. Taking the example of constructing a new house, the expenditure approach would simply include the value of the house. The value added approach, on the other hand, takes into account the value added at each stage in the production process, e.g. the ends price of planks of timber minus the cost of refining raw logs into that timber, etc. And finally, the end sale price of the house minus the cost of purchasing construction materials and paying for labour. Dr. Fairgray estimates the value added from construction is approximately 29.2% of the expenditure on construction. While looking only at the value added for construction enables one to estimate the economic benefits of construction to the construction sector, it does not account for the benefits of construction in these other sectors. Forestry, quarrying, electricity, plumbing, transport and logistics are a few examples of industries that benefit from increased demand for dwellings as the construction sector demands more of their goods and services. The expenditure approach captures the benefits to these other sectors as well. Dr. Fairgray notes in paragraphs 3.18 to 3.19 that my estimate is of the impacts of all lifestyle block creation in the district regardless of zoning, rather only the impacts of lifestyle lots created from rural zone land. While the focus of this assessment is on the impact of lifestyle block development on rural zone land, in order to understand the lifestyle block market, it is necessary to take into account the other zones where lifestyle blocks occur. There is a degree of substitutability between country living zone, village 1000 zone, rural subdivision as proposed, and 10 to 20 hectare block of farmland. Properties in each of these categories are broadly substitutable. If, for example, no future rural subdivision was enabled, then some potential purchasers from this market would purchase in each of the above substitute options, and some purchasers would decide there are no suitable alternatives and choose to locate outside the district. In order to understand the impact of rural subdivision to create lifestyle blocks, the wider lifestyle block market, most initial evidence estimates that 3.8% of all land in the district is currently used for lifestyle blocks. And this will increase to 5.7% over the next 30 years, an increase of 1.9% of total land. Table 5.3 suggests that over a 40-year period to 2061, a cumulative loss of value of 51 to 102 million in present value terms and 138 to 276 million in undiscounted terms occurs in the primary sector as a result of rural subdivision. This is equivalent to a loss of 7.5 to 15% of primary sector production in 2020, substantially more than the 1.9% loss. This is significantly less than the benefits of rural subdivision to the wider economy of $2 to $3 billion, as outlined in my initial evidence, even if adjusted down to 29.2% as value added for construction, etc., as preferred by Dr. Fairgray. In my opinion, the evidence on rural subdivision supports the conclusions that there is no practical limit on the number of lifestyle blocks that can be expected to occur under the Waikato District Plan. Land supply is unconstrained and will meet demand of around 200 lifestyle blocks per annum. Rural lifestyle blocks result in economic benefits that significantly outweigh the economic costs, and rural lifestyle blocks that include additional native vegetation or the protection of native vegetation have greater economic benefits than rural lifestyle blocks that do not. Thank you. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Let's see if there are any questions. Mr. Mark?
No, that was very thorough. Thank you very much.
Ms. Gibb?
No, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, I'm just trying to pick up where I saw it. I think it was about 10. You talked about the value per hectare. Was it one? I'm just trying to pick up. You talked about 1 hectare of planting would create one lot. Is that what you're referring to?
In paragraph,
1 hectare TDR?
Yes, I see.
The paragraph 10, yeah.
Okay, one moment. Yes, that's right. So that's one of the central market considerations. If you are doing an in situ subdivision using revegetation, it's profitable with up to 3 hectares of planting. Whereas if you were to do a TDR, it's only profitable up to 1 hectare of planting. And that goes back to the reason that there are other pathways for the market to create TDRs as proposed, and some of those are less expensive. So the less expensive options, for example, protecting existing native vegetation, sets a lower price for that TDR in the marketplace. So it's quite a bit harder to create a TDR through revegetation for that reason.
Okay, thank you. I've understood that now. Thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
No, I don't think I have any questions either. Thanks, Mr. Thompson. Thanks for your evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Thompson. You'll note on paragraph 10.2 of my legal submissions that I have flagged the evidence of Mr. Forrester, and I think he mentioned this morning that he has been also sort of working in sports middlemers, so we're just formally adopting his evidence also on TDRs.
Thank you.
Just for your reference.
Thank you.
We'll now go to the landscape amenity values evidence of Mr. Pryor, and he's with us, so he's going to come on screen, hopefully.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and the Commissioners. The thrust of my evidence was to outline how the relief sought by the submitter can manage change and mitigate potential adverse effects on rural character, whilst also maintaining the rural character and amenity values. I acknowledge that while rural production activities are critical to the future sustainability and functioning of the district economy and social well-being, the underlying reality is that some areas of the existing rural environment are inappropriate for farming activities and more suited for land use management practices with associated lifestyle activities. The relief sought by the submitter is a tool which can expedite ecological enhancement while ensuring that fragmentation of larger land holdings is minimised and sensitively designed development is allowed to occur. And this can be achieved through appropriate mechanisms for siting, building design and materials to maintain rural community values, and through Indigenous revegetation work to restore important ecological linkages and reinforce the distinctive landscape patterns in rural areas, as well as increasing the visual absorption capacity of rural areas through vegetative screening and backdrop integration planting. I consider that there are a number of site-specific design responses for subdivision provisions that could be applied to avoid, remedy and mitigate any potential significant adverse effects of buildings and structures on the rural character and amenity, including respecting the landform and vegetation characteristics, minimising the earthworks, avoiding urban characteristics, for example, the use of swales instead of the urban channel, rural character building design guidelines and guidelines on colours and materiality, as well as clustering of lots into hamlets to engender a more rural character. In my opinion, Indigenous revegetation planting can be successfully utilised to restore ecological linkages and reinforce the distinctive landscape patterns in the Waikato rural areas, as well as increasing the visual absorption capacity of the rural areas through vegetative screening and mitigation and integration planting. The protection, enhancement and restoration of degraded natural and physical resources, watercourses, streams, gullies and steep, unstable, erosion-prone land is a priority. Streams and watercourses could be revegetated to enhance the site's vegetative framework, wild corridors and landscape and rural character. This would also assist with the visual integration of future development while better managing extreme rainfall events. Steep, unstable slopes, and in particular those associated with drainage gullies and steep escarpment faces, would be retired from farming use and revegetated, enhancing future land management by restricting inappropriate land use activities and enhancing the visual integration of built development in the landscape. Vegetative framework planting within the lots would include backdrop, foreground and shoulder planting designed to partially screen dwellings while also grounding built form and fragmenting constructed form. I therefore consider that incentive-based enhancement subdivision to restore the fragmented ecological patterns and biodiversity with positive environmental outcomes is an innovative and integrated land use planning strategy. In my view, it could be successfully implemented in appropriate locations in rural areas without adversely affecting the rural character and amenity values of the Waikato rural countryside. And as outlined in my evidence, I have visited the Middlemiss Enhancement Subdivision site at 95 Jericho Road and consider that to be a huge success and a great example of what can be achieved. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Pryor. Let's see if there's questions of you. Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thanks.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions.
Ms. Gibb?
No, very clear presentation, thank you.
I've just got one, Mr. Pryor. I mean, I understand the benefit, if you like, of or the landscape or whatever you want to call it, benefits of creating more riparian planting and more SNA areas and those sorts of things. The proposal that Middlemiss and others have put before us is to confine the donor lots to this so-called 2 kilometre wide strip. Doesn't that have and it's that strip that's sort of associated with major roadways and things. Doesn't that mean that that would fundamentally change the rural character of what people in transit that experience that wider landscape would be seeing? So instead of seeing rolling paddocks and everything else, they'd be seeing screen planting and houses. I know that's a question of scale and degree, but is that a desirable outcome?
I think given that 2 kilometre sort of distance, I mean, people transiting down those roads will be more familiar with seeing built development. But I think it's really a lot of it is dependent on the sort of the site specifics, and particularly with the example at 95 Jericho Road and my sort of travelling around that area, that there's a very good visual absorption capacity within that area through the water courses and just the landform and vegetation characteristics. So I don't consider that it would take on a more urban character.
Okay. And do you have any idea of the aerial extent of this proposed corridor? I mean, we've been told that it's 2 kilometres wide, but how many hectares does it cover? Do you know? Or
no, I wouldn't be able to tell you, sorry.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for your evidence, Mr. Pryor. It's very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Hartley obviously had that plan attached to his evidence.
Yes,
he might be able to
all right.
assist the panel on that. And just before I forget, I'm not sure if the panel is planning to do any site visits, but we'd be more than happy, maybe through Mr. Forrester and some of the examples he has, but for the panel to visit, for example, Jericho Road, just to see the, in the flesh.
Okay, thank you.
So that offer's certainly on the table. Thank you for
Thanks
that.
very much.
So now Mr. Hartley, hopefully he's able to join us. Shane, are you there?
I think he's on mute.
Okay. Shane, maybe if you can take yourself off mute by the sounds of it and start talking, and you should come up on screen.
No, you're back now.
Yes, thank you. That's good. Can you hear me all right?
Not really. Very
Can you
faint.
hear me now? How's that?
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Good, good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Because I've got a fairly lengthy summary statement by necessity, Mr. Chair. I'll just propose to paraphrase some of it and shorten your time.
That's fine, thank you.
I just highlight the my paragraph 2.2 and just emphasise that effectively the proposed changes in my evidence to the objectives and policies and rules are obviously a comprehensive approach, and the proposed changes to objectives and policies from my side are clearly intended to provide a complementary approach to the proposed TDR and in situ rules that or lead to them that are proposed, so that they are necessary in that respect. I also just highlight 2.3, and we're not going to talk about biodiversity, but I just want to emphasise also water quality and high quality soil protection, which go hand in hand. And in that respect, I'll just remind at the points I've raised in 2.8 about the implications of the national policy statements and national environmental standards that are going to have a huge impact on pretty much all rural landowners and farmers, and also highlight the recent addition to the Resource Management Act requiring farmers to set back 3 metres from watercourses over where there's a more than 1 metre width in those watercourses, and that requires setting back and fencing 3 metres back. That will be introduced, I understand, by district or area by further regulation, but once it's in there, of course, we don't know where it's going to apply, and it could come into Waikato at any time. All of those requirements have significant cost implications just for the fencing alone, and I can, having been last week in the Environment Court in the for Northern Regional Council when we were discussing these very matters, the setback rules, I can tell you that one of the big issues with that also is what happens within that 3 metres of a fence and the watercourse. Is it planted in indigenous vegetation, or does it just go into weeds and so on? Certainly as a planner involved in this area, I would prefer that it went into indigenous planting, and of course all of this is part of the tapestry we're trying to build up here with these proposed rules, because everything has a cost, the fencing and the planting. I have just to briefly highlight the comments about high quality soils and in my paragraph 3.2. As I hope I've emphasised, I'm not at all discounting the importance of high quality soils and the need to protect the productive capacity of those. And in fact, one of the rules that I've recommended focuses very much on the smaller land areas to achieve that, rather than the larger areas.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Sorry, Mr. Hartley, someone whose screen says John has their microphone on and sounds like they're having a conversation in the background. Thank you.
Looks like they've muted. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, that rule I've proposed to protect smaller high quality sites and to allow amalgamation and some transfer benefit is intended very much to preserve those sites for farming activities, but the smaller areas, which I don't believe the existing rules do adequately. In my 3.6, I've really just emphasised the need that it is a combination of ratios, lot yield caps, and the type structures that I think need to be focused on with a bit more nuance than has occurred to date. And certainly the plan has addressed some of these matters in the proposed rules it does have, and the responses the council officers and consultants have brought in. But I believe that needs to be further rolled out to focus on wetlands and riparian planting and non-vet revegetation and less managed revegetation with the different ratios that I've suggested. I've also just emphasised 3.9 that the proposed rules focus on really just continuing the pattern that the existing cluster rules propose. Although they do provide for in situ that's very limited. I don't believe that there's desirable to have a large number of in situ sites alongside or around many of these areas, particularly the existing SNAs. And so I've continued with a maximum of 5 in the clusters that already exist in the proposed rules. Just briefly to comment on, to take that slightly further, if I may, the existing proposed general and hamlet rules that are in the Section 42A report from the council are fine as they go, but I just point out that both of them, in effect, provide an opportunity which may or may not have beneficial effects. And I'd just highlight, for example, the rural hamlet subdivision, where it basically encourages the amalgamation of up to 5 sites. I simply question the objective of that. The balance area may or may not have high quality soils. There are many sites around the Waikato region in my district, in my understanding, that could be occupied by one farming activity, and there are many horticultural market garden activities which are over a number of these titles. Although it's a useful provision for those who do want to amalgamate, many may not. And some of the more remote farms, as we all know, may be made up of multiple titles, all of which can potentially have the effect of either 1, not being used at all, so this rule is not helpful, or 2, it starts to create clusters in very remote locations, very distant ad hoc locations, possibly up metal roads. There's no real purpose or assessment of effect in terms of what the outcome of that might be. And while there are assessment criteria, I'm not sure how effective they will be. The other side of that is the rural hamlet rule. Again, there are some. Sorry, that was the rural hamlet rule. I've just mentioned and I've talked about the general rule, which basically provides the ability to have one site if you've got a 40 hectare block. Again, I just question where the benefit is there, other than to the landowner, perhaps being able to create a retirement lot or something of that order. But as I understand that rule, there's no other requirement in ecological or biodiversity terms. The key thrust of my evidence, and I think everybody, all the other experts, Full Minimus and Buckland Group, is that this provides a market mechanism basically, which is to fund ecological works. I'm certainly well aware from the evidence that's been produced now, and also in the previous Cabra Environment Court case and the IHB in Auckland, the cost of implementing this work is very high, and it's not only implementing the work that's high, it's also the maintenance of pest and weeds within the landowner that has covenanted this land, and that can amount to several $1,000s per hectare to maintain an active pest management weed control, and that's forever. So when these landowners covenant land and transfer titles off for a given price, they're entering into a contract to maintain the pest and weed control forever, in perpetuity. So this isn't a buy a new boat type of mechanism at all. This is buying into a very expensive contract, and as the other experts have highlighted, this needs to be calibrated for the Waikato district market. It's not the Auckland market. It may be one day, and that's something that would be looked at on a monitoring basis by council staff. And then in that case, the figures might be altered. The ratios are simply a mechanism. I just highlight also, I know questions have been asked about the 2 kilometre strip. It is just a figure, isn't it? And I've suggested 2 kilometres for the primary reason of it being a proxy for the same sort of countryside living zone that is in the Auckland Unitary Plan, where there's actually a defined zone. And the difference there, of course, is that zone requires is fairly liberally applied. It requires a 2 hectare minimum site average with a minimum area applied. Now, what happens, of course, when you transfer a site in, you're able to bring that average down to 1 hectare and in fact have sites at 8,000 square metres. So that zone has been set up where it has a variation control over it to absorb the transferred sites. And those landowners that want to undertake that can achieve a pretty high density within those areas. To give you an idea about the scale, I think the question was asked, how large is the area that I've identified in the 2 kilometre setback area? I think it's about 1,200 square kilometres.
Thank you.
The countryside living area around Dairy Flat, as a comparison, Dairy Flat Cumu, which is one of the larger countryside living areas in the Auckland area. I'm not sure what proportion it is off the top of my head, but I would guess at possibly 30% or so. That is 5% of that area. So that would be about 65 square kilometres. The difference is, of course, is that whole area can theoretically and potentially be subdivided to a 1 hectare average density. And so in identifying a fairly expansive 2 kilometre setback, I've done so on the basis that in no way would I countenance a density of 1 per hectare. And it's really important to provide the opportunity to have highly separated clusters within that area and to make sure that the character and amenity and productive values are still protected. I've highlighted that this should be a discretionary activity, as I have for all of these rules, so they bring on all of the objectives and policies of the plan, including the outstanding natural landscape provisions and so on. So it does sound extensive, but in fact, it provides the capacity to absorb these sites and to have them properly assessed as a discretionary activity and refused if they don't stack up, quite honestly. The other key aspect for the 2 kilometres is that I've taken what I call a sustainable management approach to that, and thinking that because they're focused on existing urban areas, main roads and schools, in other words, public services, they're all within 5 to 10 minutes at most of those facilities. And so therefore, rather than having countryside living or rural residential opportunities many kilometres in the countryside, they're all pretty much located where many of those people will work, or their children will go to school, or they'll go to shop. So it's arguably almost walkable. And secondly, it's certainly within a very short drive. And so there is a multifaceted approach to identifying that 2 kilometres. I hope that's helpful, Mr. Chairman, and I apologise for the length of the explanation, but I'm just trying to predict or get in front of some of the questions that might come.
Oh, that's fine, Mr. Hartley. Thank you for your evidence. Let's see how we go with questions. Ms. Gibb?
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Just one thing that came to mind when you were talking about covenanting the land that's put aside. Now, I'm presuming you're talking about the land that's been reverted into a natural environment through planting, and who's going to the covenants on that land is to who? I mean, it's you know, you've got no guarantee once you've sold it that it's going to stay covenanted, have you? You said you did, but I don't know who you're going to cover it with.
Well, it's generally covenanted in the council or the QE2 or some similar body, and of course, often or usually those areas are required to be fenced and that pest and weed management be undertaken, and that becomes then down to a compliance responsibility of the council, or it could be whatever body, but generally it's the council compliance.
Yeah, I was involved in a hearing recently at Port Waikato, and large amount of land there was to be covenanted, but I'm aware of what's being offered, but I don't know in 10 years' time whether it's going to be guaranteed. And I think that's the point I'm trying to come to here is, It sounds all very well at the start, but do councils really want to end up with it? And that would be a question I think you'd have to take seriously to ratepayers, because there'd be a huge cost in maintaining all this.
Yes, I think certainly, and that's a really fair question, and I believe it came up in the Auckland appeal hearings, is that the council hadn't been entirely effective in maintaining that compliance inspection process. But bear in mind that there are fees under the Act. It's possible to charge for councils to charge for the cost of compliance or inspections, and so that is a user pays approach that's quite feasible and I think is appropriate. But I think it also picks up on the answers that I think Dr. Keesing mentioned, that the protection and enhancement of these areas of bush, particularly the existing SNAs, is a public benefit and a public responsibility as much as a landowner's. And so there's a little bit of that angle comes into it as well. We can't underestimate the impact of the national policy statements that are being implemented and have just come in, and also the biodiversity NPS, which is likely to come in very shortly, in how that will affect rural areas of New Zealand and will affect landowners and farmers and their ability to produce and sell goods. I don't think we can properly estimate the effects of that. So anything which provides a buffer, as we're proposing here, to help underpin some of those costs is going to be really useful. And I think by applying those to beneficial subdivision, in other words, people who want to live in the countryside in a managed way, is a really good equation and a pretty equitable way of trying to achieve that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Marr, anything from you?
Yeah, kia ora, Mr. Hartley. Just thinking back to the chairman asking, I think it was Mr. Pryor, about the cost associated to what you've provided is obviously quite an expensive, and the maintenance going on into the future is going to be equally costly.
Yep.
But it's about public funding availability. And I guess my question is, there is, and I think that's what the chair was alluding to, there is a number of bodies that you can go to get assistance to do riparian work or establishment of wetlands. My question is, do you think farmers are generally aware of this?
Oh, look, I can't speak for all farmers, but I know some are in my travels for sure. Right. Yeah.
And then also when it comes to pest management, I'm just thinking about the Waikato Regional Council, and I think they budget around about $9 million a year on pest management, whether it be flora or fauna. And largely, once identified as a priority pest, they actually take up the running in the sense of managing a lot of that too, financially, because our rate money has gone towards contributing towards paying for that.
Right.
So that assists us too, I'd imagine, as farmers.
Well, it would indeed. But again, it's just how much will it cost to deal with all of the existing areas, let alone the new areas that are going to be coming through. And 9 million sounds a lot, but my estimation is it's probably a drop in the bucket on a per hectare rate for achieving that. And that's also not taking into account, of course, all the voluntary labour and effort that goes into it from farmers who do that themselves often. Which is often unrecognised, but it is a cost, because they're obviously doing that while they're not doing something else productive, arguably. That's a choice they make.
Mm.
But I can say that my most recent example of the maintenance cost, I'm pretty certain for a 4 hectare covenant was something in the order of $1,500 or $2,000 per hectare per year for a pretty intensive maintenance ratio. And that would probably be cheaper on a bigger area, obviously, where you get more economy of scale. But it is an expensive process to have professionals come and do that work, or contractors come and do that work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Mark. Mr. Cooney?
Yeah, Mr. Hartley, who enforces the council would enforce the covenant? How do they enforce it?
The covenant is the covenant includes the requirements for that work to be undertaken, and the covenant is in favour of the council.
Yeah, I know that.
Yes.
But you got an errant landowner who says, no, I'm not going to do any work. I've had enough. I'm not going to do it. How then what do you do in that situation? What does the council do? Do you know?
I honestly haven't come across that situation. I can't answer that. I'm not sure if Mr. Fuller can assist, but I haven't seen that situation.
How do you see it, Mr. Fuller? Because that looks like to me you'd have to take proceedings in either the district court or the high court to enforce the covenant.
Yes, it goes back a little bit earlier to a question from Mr. Fulton. I think there might have been a slight miscommunication about there's no vesting here, so the council's not taking land. It is covenants. They are in favour of either QE2 usually or the council, and that's something that's an option that landowners and the council will explore. They are on the title in perpetuity, so again, Mr. Fulton, as per if the ownership changes, the obligations under the covenant persist in perpetuity. The only one that can release a covenant like that is the grantor of the covenant, so you'd have to negotiate with council to remove it, for example. I wouldn't expect they would. In terms of some of the options for ensuring ongoing long-term compliance, which is what you're asking about, these things can be bonded, but also enforcement is a cost recovery ability exercise from the council. Effectively, it's like a condition of consent, the covenant. It's quite detailed in terms of what needs to be done. I'm involved in some up north. The council goes out and inspects them. The reports are written as to compliance. Recommendations may be made about you need to tidy your fences or you need to do more weed control. If it's not done, there can be enforcement of that. Now, while it's an obviously an understandable question, one of the big issues that came up in Canberra, and we had evidence at the hearing, was that the council came along and said its enforcement officers were saying that there's problems with these things in terms of compliance. It actually got to the point in Canberra, I understand, where the council was invited by the court to identify sites for it to go and inspect to see this non-compliance. And they got in a helicopter and visited many sites in the region, and the court at the end of that was not satisfied at all that there was this degree of non-compliance that the council was alleging, and obviously it endorsed the provisions, notwithstanding the fact that you might get the odd recalcitrant owner that you need to take to account, but it hasn't been the issue that it was claimed in that hearing, at least.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
I don't think I have any questions. Thanks, Mr. Hartley. I think what you're seeking is clear. I think I've understood the rules and policy framework that you're talking about. So any questions that I'd ask would probably be more to do with philosophy than anything else, and I don't think that will necessarily advance things too much.
Thank you.
But thank you for your evidence. It's comprehensive and it's certainly given us food for thought. So thank you for that.
Appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and that pretty much concludes our case. If I may just make one sort of final comment, which may not have been made sufficiently in my legal submissions. There has been a suggestion that these provisions shouldn't be introduced to the district plan because they are somehow incompatible either with the growth strategy or the existing policies and rules. And as the panel will be aware, it needs to make sure that the plan is obviously horizontally integrated in terms of compatible and that the plan works within itself, but whether or not these provisions are actually consistent with what exists in the plan now is not the legal test in my submission. It is the tests, for example, the RPS, the Act, national policy statements. That's what plan provisions must give effect to. Otherwise, you can see it's a bit of a circular argument. To reject our relief because it's actually different to what's in the plan is just a circular argument. It's not actually what the legal framework is in my submission. Having said that, yes, we want a plan that's linked and joined up and is compatible within itself. So I just thought I'd make that clear. And I do note, and I don't make a big store of it, but the regional council evidence, from what I've seen, it hasn't really commented on the Middlemist position from its perspective. And I note that Fed Farmers and a few other submitters have supported little miss in their submissions. So thank you to the panel for their time today. If there's anything further, obviously get in touch. I did also provide the 2018 Cabra case. They really have to be looked at together if you hadn't already understood that, because if you just jump into the 2021, it's a bit confusing.
No, well, the interim decisions, the interim decision sets out the reasoning, doesn't it?
Indeed. But in terms of the schedule and the final result, you might say it is that Schedule 3. And for the reasons that have been outlined in evidence today, we think there's a good framework. The principles are sound, but we do think we need to adjust the ratios and the triggers and thresholds, etc., for the Waikato situation. So thanks for that, Mr. Chair.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Fuller.
Mr. Chair, can I just have one further question?
Sure.
Mr. Fuller, just very quickly though.
Yes.
There's something like about 75 territorial authorities in New Zealand, and my understanding is that the transferable TDRs is pretty well located in what was the former Franklin, now in Auckland, of course, and Rodney. Is that fair comment? I mean, I know they have other rights through conservation and so on, like within most councils, but the transferable ones for land like this is quite unique to that part of the country?
Not necessarily. My understanding is Western Bay District Council has provisions, and they, I think, came up, and Mr. Kearney might be familiar with those. I mean, there's always issues with, there might be a bit of tweaking, or, sometimes they don't work as well as they should. But we have put the best foot forward in terms of these provisions. And even yesterday, Commissioner, Doug Fairgrave, who's the council's witness, obviously, Dr. Fairgrave, conceded that TDR mechanisms can be very effective in terms of, for example, amalgamating fragmented titles, as per the example of Mr. Forrester and the Ball Group. They can be very effective at enabling restoration and protection of land that is too remote for people to want to live in situ, or for what Dr. Keesing said, you don't necessarily want the people in that wetland or that special area, but you want it protected. The thing is, you can't force people to protect other than through regulation and or incentives, in the sense that even with the SNAs, they won't be protected until someone makes an application to subdivide, and therefore triggers that. So the incentives are certainly provided for in the RPS, where it actually has a policy. You'll recall, I think it's in the evidence in the section 42A, that the RPS policy actually requires district councils to explore economic instruments. TDRs are a classic economic instrument, as well as the incentivisation is also an economic instrument.
Thank you.
Just, Mr. Fuller, you asked us to read, just as an aside, another legal decision. When was the last time you saw a 10 to 20 page Environment Court decision?
I think the Long Bay one was the classic, wasn't it? Yes, it's the good old days. Quite refreshing, isn't it, to have a no disrespect to the court. I mean, in some ways, these things are, we're refining our understanding too. But yes, that's why, with respect, you can really nitpick over the numbers of lots to be created, and you can go right down to the detail. But to some extent, that's, I suppose, the thrust of my submission. Let's keep it high level. Let's keep it to the principles. This work is expensive. This work is good. We've got this problem. We've got 10% biodiversity. We probably need about 30. How are we going to get there? And this is a method to try and achieve that. So, but yes, your point is taken. Okay. But I should be careful how we comment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Fuller. And that brings us to Hort, New Zealand, please.
Hi, sorry. Can you hear us properly?
Yes, thank you.
My name is Lucy Deverell. I'm the North Island Policy Advisor for Horticulture New Zealand. I have Barnes Hodgson here, who's provided planning evidence for subdivision, and Lynette Wharf, who's provided a planning analysis for the wider framework. I'll do a brief introduction of my summary and then followed by Vance and Lynette. Would you like to take questions in between?
Well, let's see how we go.
Okay, great. All right.
See how we go. Get on.
So you've read my summary, so I won't
Yes, we have. Thank you.
delve too much into it. I suppose I'll just highlight the key points, I suppose, is that the regulatory environment has huge influence on the factors that contribute to the productivity and versatility of highly productive land. Central to this is setting expectations on what constitutes rural character and amenity. This has a ripple effect on the types of activities that are provided for, the status of those activities, and the management of effects. Horticulture is limited in where it can locate, LUC 1 to 4 generally. Therefore, operational efficiency and the ability to maximise productive land is paramount to continued operation and development of the horticulture industry. Operational efficiency through activities such as seasonal worker accommodation and practice change, such as artificial crop protection structures. These are all paramount to sort of meeting demand for fruit and vegetables. Recent COVID-19 events have really highlighted the importance of considering food security and the impact that the regulatory environment has in providing for that long-term provision. So that's just sort of a highlights.
That's helpful. That's very, we have read your evidence and your summary. So, I mean, that's good, and it's a scene set. So I think we might hold questions and keep going and see what we end up with at the end of the next statement.
Right. Thank you, Lucy. Kia ora, everybody. Vance Hodgson, planning consultant with Horticulture New Zealand. So my evidence obviously addresses the Hearing 18 rural subdivision matter. And my evidence is fairly brief, as is my summary, which yes, I understand you have read. So just highlighting a couple of points from my evidence, I really, I guess, roll in behind the Section 42A assessment and the recommendations there on rural subdivision, and in particular the recommendations there to retain the parent lot qualifier date, and also the recommendation to extend the parent lot qualifier size from 20 hectares to 40 hectares. It's my opinion that those larger units are a resource, a really important resource, and in fact quite a scarce resource when we look at the data that the District Council have put together. Not all of those units will be productive, if that's the term, but certainly in my experience that recognition of those productive values requires us to take a precautionary approach, particularly to subdivision that might then compromise that future production potential. And we've seen regionally in the Waikato and certainly nationally this greater recognition of rural production values that are particularly associated with commercial vegetable production. In the Waikato region, that recognition occurs through the decisions version of the Waikato Regional Plan Change 1, the Healthy Rivers Plan Change, that now sees a regulatory pathway to provide for a provisional area of growth in commercial vegetable production, specifically in the Waikato, to meet the anticipated need of population growth over the lifespan of that plan. So there's a defined area of growth defined by catchment or sub-catchment by a spatial limit. And those values are recognised through the objective and policy structure of that regional plan change as well. And at a national level, we've seen the progression of the draft national policy statement for highly productive land. And my understanding is that the most recent advice from the Ministry for the Environment around the progression of that national policy statement is that it's likely to be reported back to Cabinet about mid next year, I think. So we may see a national policy statement mid next year. Who knows? I mean, it's a draft, but certainly those values have been recognised nationally, and the issues associated with land fragmentation and rural subdivision and urban growth on those soils. Just looking through my notes, and I know there's often a focus on the economic benefits that are derived through rural subdivision, particularly for the rural lifestyle living type. I call it a voucher lot subdivision. We look at a general subdivision lot option, and those economic benefits. It's really difficult to sort of compare apples with apples or potatoes with potatoes, I suppose. When you I don't know how many resource consents I've been through and plan changes where, when you compare an economic assessment for a proposed residential development or an urban development relative to an existing rural production activity, things don't. You're not comparing the same values really, and time and time again, the economic benefits from a residential activity or urban activity far outweigh the productive value of a piece of land for producing vegetables. That, of course, is just one of the well-beings to consider in decision making. But certainly for me, it's the value of that land for producing food that is effectively paramount. So again, just reiterating my support for the Section 42A recommendations around that general subdivision rule structure. And just, looking at my summary, the only other matters there I included, related matter was around the thresholds for high-class soils within new child lots, again, supporting the recommendation and the findings of the Section 42A and the rebuttal around how that matter is to be considered in those new subdivision arrangements, and likewise support for a specified building platform to be identified at the time of subdivision. I've certainly seen that to be a useful method that enables that on-site assessment of the relationship with a building platform with the surrounding activity and anticipated activity in that rural environment. And that's probably enough in terms of my comments.
Thanks, Mr. Hodgson. Let's carry on with Ms. Wharf, and then we'll see what questions we might have. Thank you.
Sure.
Good afternoon. You've got my evidence in chief, my summary, and also a supplementary statement in response to submissions that were left out of the section.
Yes, we have. Thank you.
Yes. So if you want to, if there's questions on that, I'm happy to take them. So I suppose in terms of my summary, if I start around paragraph 8, and I think that the key issue for me is the difference in philosophical approach towards the rural environment in Waikato that I have from Mr. Cleese. And I think fundamental to that difference is that I have gone through and analysed all the background documents that this plan has to give effect to or not be inconsistent with. And I come to the point that, especially around the planning standards, which the hearing panel have been quite clear they want to implement as far as possible. And the zone framework quite clearly sets out that the activities that are to be located in the rural zone require a rural location. Now, and I think that's fairly fundamental as to determining what is appropriate to locate in the rural zone or not. And then also looking at the RPS and a very clear direction in the RPS about rural production and not being compromised and avoid or minimise reverse sensitivity. You look at the direction, the strategic direction in chapter 1 of the plan, which you've already had hearings on, and also the section 32, which was very clear that urban activities were to be located in urban environments. And that's not to say that activities such as schools or rural schools shouldn't locate in the rural environment. They require a rural location, so they're appropriate. The problem is, and we've seen it in many districts around New Zealand, where people see rural land as open space to be filled with all sorts of other activities. And so there are examples of schools that aren't rural schools, don't require a rural location, wanting to locate into a rural area, or an example in Hawke's Bay is a Sikh temple wanting to locate into a rural area with a school, with sports fields, with orchards right next door. Now, this is just, that particular facility did not demand or require a rural location. It was just their desire to. So where I think we need to make a clear differentiation is, does something require a rural location, or is it just desirable that they want a rural location? And that's where I draw a line different to Mr. Cleese. And I believe that line is important in terms of giving effect to the higher order documents that, that underpin this plan. I've attached, I did a table, I think you will have seen, that I set out the different types of activities and showed that some of those activities can happen as permitted activities or consented, such as rural industry. But it's not saying they're not appropriate, but they're appropriate within the boundaries of requiring a rural location. If I then go on to my paragraph 9 about terminology and this confusion over productive rural activities, farming, primary production, and I have recommended that you would consider using rural production activities where the term primary production activities isn't appropriate because of the wider context of including mining and quarrying. I think it's important that whatever terms are used are defined, and certainly productive rural activities is not defined, and there's no recommendation to define it. In terms of Objective 5.1.1, I noticed the comments you asked yesterday of Mr. Cleese about, is it really a strategic objective, or is it, and questions around that. It's a little bit confusing because Objective 5.1.1 was actually also considered as part of Hearing 3, and there's an overlap of how it goes. But I certainly believe that that strategic objective needs to be very clear about what is anticipated to occur in the zone. I did not support the use of the word, the addition of community facilities or community activities or educational facilities being supported. I thought that was not clear language. And I also have supported the Hort New Zealand submission, which sought that there was clarity about what country living and subdivision would be appropriate in the rural zone. Now, that part of the submission has not been addressed in any 42A report, and I think it's important to consider, should that strategic objective be establishing the framework for where subdivision may or may not happen. In terms of rural character and the policy 532, and again, I noticed your comments yesterday that in fact it was really, the recommended 532 is really essentially a description that you might find in an issues or a description part of the plan, and I agree. And in my evidence in chief, again, a submission of Hort New Zealand's that was not picked up in the 42A report was the submission that sought a policy for rural character. And the policy that has been put forward is one that has been used in in a range of rural districts, very similar to Waikato. Horowhenua, which has similar to Waikato, it's got vegetable production, it's got small rural towns, and the planners there have found having that policy has been very useful in terms of addressing and assessing applications in terms of rural character. So I certainly support the the alternative wording we put up for policy 532, much preferred over and above what is recommended in the 42A report. In terms of rural industry, I don't see the need for rural commercial to be separated out, because if you actually look at the definition of rural industry in the planning standard definition, it includes rural industry and businesses, and as far as I'm concerned, those businesses would include the commercial type businesses that Mr. Cleese is referring to. So I don't think we need the duplication that's being recommended. Certainly support rural industry being provided for within the rural zone or environment, because it's fundamental, and it does require often a rural location and is fundamental to the primary production activities. And in terms of the approach in the plan to have non-complying for other industrial activities that are not rural industry, certainly support that approach. My paragraph 14, I talk about the non-rural activities, which I've just sort of alluded to under that strategic objective, and the clear demarcation. I notice, for instance, retirement villages were wanting the same status in the rural zone as the country living zone, and I agree with Mr. Gleeson saying no, they have a different purpose, and it's not appropriate that retirement villages might be an RDA in the rural zone. Childcare and education, I have sought that be moved to either a discretionary as notified. I do not consider that the move to RDA for those is appropriate unless they require that a rural location. Reverse sensitivity, again, is another policy that Mr. Cleese has recommended be totally revamped. I don't disagree with the need to revamp it, but I don't particularly like the format in which it's been done, because I think the focus still needs to focus on reverse sensitivity, especially to give effect to the RPS policies around reverse sensitivity in primary production. I will note that there is a setback in the plan for residential activities of 25 metres from so that if there is a residential activity happening next to a growing operation, a dwelling would have to be set back 25 metres, but there is no setback for other sensitive land uses that are not residential. So for instance, a school, a church, a cafe, playing fields, anything else that's sensitive land use but non-residential has no setback in the plan. Now, I have supported in Rule 22.372 an addition of another setback for sensitive land uses that are non-residential to ensure that there is at least some setback provided for in the plan for those activities, which is really important in terms of addressing the reverse sensitivity effects. The artificial crop protection structures are a key issue for growers, and we've provided you with additional supplementary evidence regarding those, as there seems to have been some misunderstanding about the submissions and the setbacks. We've provided you with examples where these structures are not classed as buildings, and under the planning standards definition there is well, I call it a moot point as to whether the cloth which lets the rain through is indeed a roof, and so whether in fact it is a building. But not all. So if we take a step back from that definition, artificial crop protection structures that are simply vertical with no cover over the top are not classed as a building. and therefore they don't fall under the provisions prevailing about buildings. It is only when there is a horizontal cover on that they would trigger the need for a to be classed as a building. So what Hort New Zealand is saying, and I have put forward, is that because some will be classed as a building and some may be classed as a building and some not, it is better to deal with the whole suite of things as a standalone activity.
Yeah, we understand that, thanks.
Yeah.
Made that clear.
Worker accommodation, various propositions have been put forward, and the 120 metres for minor dwelling may suffice for some worker accommodation, but it certainly doesn't address the need for the more seasonal worker type accommodation, which Horticulture New Zealand has sought. And I think it would be highly unlikely that the provisions for minor dwellings would suffice in that instance. So that is still an outstanding matter. The other issue that I would raise, the setbacks from water bodies I raised in my evidence in chief seem to have become rather enlarged, and that was a concern, and I have sought that they be pulled back, because the concept of having the size of the Esplanade Reserve plus an additional setback seemed rather to enlarge the size of those setbacks beyond what would normally be anticipated. But I'm happy to take questions. You've got my full evidence and my supplementary, if that's suffice at the moment.
Thank you very much. Let's see if there's any questions, and if there are, you can divvy it up amongst yourselves is probably the best way to go, I think. Ms. Gibb, do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
Mr. Mark?
Very detailed, Ms. Wolf, but I have no questions.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, no, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
No, I don't think I do. I think we've sort of canvassed the issues that we're unclear on, and you've made it clear what your position is. So I think it's for us to wrestle with the various views that have been expressed, but I don't think I have any questions that will help in that. So thank you for your evidence, the three of you, and we'll take that with us and make our decision in due course. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Which brings us to 3:15, which is afternoon tea time, noting that Heritage New Zealand aren't appearing today or aren't appearing at the hearing. They've submitted evidence but won't be here, so we're totally on time. We'll adjourn now until 3:30 and see you all back then. For those of you that have just joined, please don't log off, just turn your microphone off or your video. And everybody, we're ready to, good afternoon everyone, we're ready to resume. And ready for you, please, Ms. Foley, for the Regional Council.
Tēnā koutou, ko Miffy Foley toko ingoa. He rawe hikite I tātou I tēnā rā. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I've sent through an amended summary statement, which I hope you will have received, which has my response to the rebuttal evidence from the Section 42A report officers.
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I support the majority of the recommendations made in relation to the Waikato Regional Council's submission. I particularly support the recommended increase in the subdivision threshold to 40 hectares. This will go a long way towards minimising the fragmentation of productive rural land. This recommendation has been well supported by expert evidence and aligns well with the RPS direction and with national direction as signalled by the proposed National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land. So in my evidence, I requested a small number of changes to better implement and align with regional direction. I note that Mr. Cleese has responded in his rebuttal evidence to most of these points. The first area is in relation to afforestation in high and outstanding natural character areas. So in our submission, we requested amendment to Rule 22.1.5 D15 to include afforestation of significant natural areas as a discretionary activity. I agree with Mr. Cleese that the NES for plantation forestry controls need not be replicated, and that these address afforestation in SNA. However, in my opinion, there is scope and justification for retaining control over afforestation and natural character areas as addressed in this rule. So I've requested that the rule be retained as notified in the district plan, and I consider these provisions are necessary to address the threats to identified high and outstanding natural character areas and to implement the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement and the RPS. I note that Mr. Cleese in his rebuttal evidence agrees with my assessment of the scope. However, he suggests this could be addressed through the landscape topic. The Section 42A report for Hearing 21B landscapes has already been released, however, and evidence submitted, although the hearing itself has been delayed and has not happened yet. The Landscape Section 42A report does not specifically mention this point, as it is an existing provision, and it is in Mr. Cleese's Section 42A recommendation that this provision be amended. So I am therefore of the opinion that this rule should be retained as notified. A number of Waikato Regional Council submission points were coded to Hearing 2, all of plan, when they actually requested relief in each zone rather than across the plan as a whole. And I addressed these matters in my evidence for Hearing 2. I raised them here because they're relevant to the rural zone, but I didn't repeat them in my evidence. Mr. Cleese in his rebuttal evidence has recommended rules to address setbacks for earthworks from waterways and revegetation of earthworks, and I support these recommendations. I would also request inclusion of a building setback from waterways as a permitted activity standard, as included in my evidence. I also raised submission point 81.176 in my evidence, which relates specifically to the Lakeside Te Kowhata precinct. However, I note this was addressed in the Section 42A report for Hearing 11 for Lakeside Te Kowhata, so it does not need to be considered further. Kia ora.
Thank you, Ms. Foley. That was a summary. Thank you for that. Let's see if there's any questions. Mr. Cooney. You're on mute, Mr. Cooney.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah.
No questions, and thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb.
No questions. Thank you, Ms. Foley.
Mr. Fulton.
Yeah, I have no questions. Appreciate your summary though. Thank you.
Mr. Mayo.
Thanks for the summary, Ms. Foley, but no questions.
And I don't have any questions either, Ms. Foley. Your evidence is clear, and your summaries highlighted those key points. So thank you for your evidence.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Which brings us to Mr. Upton and Ms. Miller.
Tēnā koutou. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Shut up.
I'm Bardi Miller. My husband Simon is also present, and he will chip in at the end of my remarks. Our submission's about rural hamlets. We believe that if the rural hamlets rule is to be effective as a tool to help defragment the current patchwork of titles, council should essentially go back to the plan it notified, adopt the minimum 20 hectare balanced lot, include legal titles of less than 5,000 square metres, and reject the proposed limitation relating to high-class soil. It should also reduce the maximum cluster lot size to 1 hectare and reduce the minimum cluster lot size to 5,000 square metres, both to minimise loss of farmland. We believe the council's discretion should be limited to securing the best outcome for landscape and reverse sensitivity. I'd like to illustrate the impact of revisions to the rule by looking at a plan of part of our farm at Ngāruawāhia. It's 89 hectares in total of mixed cropping and grazing. It's been in my husband's family since 1939. Our family has watched as successive district plans have whittled away the property rights of landowners. Many property owners have felt motivated to effect whatever subdivision they were still able to effect and exit while the going was good. We haven't. The property has been in the family's ownership for over 80 years, and thank you for, that's the old version.
Oh, has there been a replacement version of that? I'm sorry. I thought I was being proactive.
Yeah, no, I think Fletcher might have that somewhere, but if he doesn't, that one will do. It's just got a bit more information on it. We can make do with that one if we haven't got it.
No. Is Mr. Bell there? Have you got that latest one handy you can put up on the screen, please?
Yeah, just locating it now.
Thank you. Sorry, Ms. Miller, just carry on and we can come back to it.
The plan, when we get to it, it shows the 36.8 hectare portion of our farm on the south side of Sawbury Road, Ngāruawāhia. It's owned by a family trust. The configuration of these 4 titles under different ownership from the other side flows from the tragic early death of my brother-in-law from a brain tumour. His widow wanted to sell her house and leave the Waikato. Later, after the death of my father-in-law, we managed to buy our sister-in-law's share in the land, thus keeping the farm together. This is the sort of real-life situation that causes rural families to alter their arrangements so they can keep farming. So now you can see we have 2 similar-sized titles of 14.4 and 18 hectares respectively. That's the pink one and the green one. We've got a 4-hectare yellow title in the middle, and we've got a 0.4 on the corner of Sawbury Road and Ngāruawāhia Road. These titles can all be legally sold right now. However, this would not be a good outcome for the preservation of rural land or the landscape. Under the notified version of the rule, the trustee could future-proof the block by amalgamating 3 of the titles and create in their place 1 large block with 3 small sections. These could be tucked away invisibly in the landscape and separated as far as possible from everyday farming activity. This would enable the main area of farmland to be preserved, notwithstanding events like the death or incapacity of the beneficiaries. It would also provide the possibility of freeing up capital to enable even more exacting and important environmental standards to be adhered to. This is by no means a high-yielding property, and there is some major wetland restoration and protection plans ahead of us. The Council's original proposed plan was a win for the community that did not yield up any additional legal entitlement to the landowner. The amendments destroy that possibility. By increasing the balance lot to 40 hectares, we fall short because the total area of the 4 titles available is just under 37 hectares. Furthermore, the new proposal to require each existing title to be at least 5,000 square metres strains us a second time because the smallest title is 4,000 square metres. This title, the blue one, resulted from my father-in-law exercising a remaining subdivisional right upon the sale of my deceased brother-in-law's house. He tried to make it as small as possible to minimise fragmentation in the event that it had to be sold. His efforts to minimise fragmentation are now to be rewarded with a rule that would exclude our eligibility to utilise the rule and minimise fragmentation. The proposed plan offered an intelligent way of enabling landowners to regroup titles to minimise fragmentation and maximise rural values. If this regrouping could result in even smaller titles, as suggested by ourselves and numerous other submitters, even less land would be lost to farming. The Council, however, has now ended up proposing a rule that is 180 degrees away from where it started and is no longer recognisable as being about rural hamlets. The overriding consideration seems to have been achieving consistency with the general subdivision rules. Perhaps it's the title Rural Hamlet Subdivision that causes the confusion, but those who propose more restrictive provisions seem to think that the original proposal had created an ingenious new way of increasing subdivision opportunities. This is simply not the case. The hamlet idea was about properties that have already been subdivided. That horse is bolted. The question is whether they can be rearranged to yield a better outcome for the rural zone. Piling on new restrictions relating to soil and infrastructure as though this were about new subdivisions is fundamentally misconceived. I can only repeat that these titles exist. The choice is whether they are left as they are, with the potential for sale in a way that breaks up the rural landscape, or rearranged so their footprint, if sold, is mitigated. And Simon will just explain the sort of thing that we were thinking about doing here.
Well, very briefly, I think Vardy has explained it all very well, but very briefly, if you look at that pink title, at the right-hand end of it, you'll see it's got a bit cut out. That was my deceased brother's house. Now, if you were going to redistribute titles, what you'd do is you'd stuff them into the lower bit below that's been taken out. I haven't got a photo here, but it's actually got access to Newsom Road, which is at the end of that block. It's in the fold of a landscape. It's invisible. You can minimise the boundaries exposure to the balance of the farming operation. So from a reverse sensitivity point of view, it's ideal. Already one house there. It actually genuinely would be a bit like a hamlet. So it's a much better reconfiguration than what we have now. So that's how you do it if you were going to, but on the revised rule would be impossible. So that's it for us.
All right, thank you, Mr. Upton. Ms. Miller, let's just see if there's any questions. Mr. Fulton?
No, I don't have any questions. I can understand what they're trying to do, but appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. May.
Nothing from me, thank you.
Is good.
No questions. I do understand the dilemma and I do know where your property is. Thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Just to clarify again, under the rule as notified, you'd be able to create two lots and one balanced lot. Is that right?
We'd be replacing these titles with 4 new titles, 3 small ones and a large one.
Yeah.
What it would give you is an absolutely clear piece of uninterrupted rural land. It defragments the whole thing. That is the gain. So everything we read from the regional council, the district council about the rural zone, protecting it from fragmentation, we could solve that very easily.
So you're squarely caught by this increase from 20 hectares up to 40, aren't you?
Yes, we are, and also the 5,000 the 5,000 square metre minimum, because that's a 4,000. There was my father creating the smallest possible section that he was legally able to do then, and putting it right on one corner so that it didn't mess up the rest of the farm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. Look, I understand the situation. So thank you very much.
No, and I think it's clear enough too for me. I don't have any questions either. Thank you. Thank you both very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. and Mrs. Cummings, please. I'm not sure if you folks have been here during the course of the morning. Were you here this morning?
No, we weren't.
I'll reiterate what I said at the start, because I think it probably applies to both of you, insofar as whilst there's been a lot of people that do this as a living appearing at our hearings, there's a number of just individuals, husbands and wives and so forth. Please don't be intimidated by the process. We're simply here to listen to what you've got to say to us. If we don't understand something, or there's something that intrigues us about what you said, we'll ask you a question to clarify, but it's not like Perry Mason on TV when we're going to, sort of probe away and try and find fault with what someone might be saying. So be as relaxed as you can, given that you're in unfamiliar territory.
It's definitely a learning curve.
So you just fire away, and I'll now be quiet, and you just tell us what you want to say, and if we've got any questions at the end, we'll ask you.
It's just Laurie and Audrey Cummings.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
We're comfortable with the rule 22.4.1.6 for conservation lot subdivision. While we're doing this is to make the best use of the bush and wetland that we have on our property, which isn't grassed, and we just want them to provide some return to us. The property is situated on the northeastern Waikato, ex-Franklin County. at a place called Mangatangi. Half of the 149 hectare property is grassland on gently sloping flat terrain from the road frontage. The Mangatangi River has a wide floodplain and it totally cuts the property in half. Beyond the river, the land rises sharply to two ranges of hills. This contains 34 hectares of bush, 3 hectares or more of wetland, and 30 hectares of hilly grassland. The rear boundary backs onto the southern end of the Hunua Ranges. The bush is described as outstanding natural landscape, which is on a property map that the Waikato County have put out. We had an ecologist write a detailed report on the bush wetland in 2007, contiguous with a wide range of species of trees, plants and birds, and a few pigs, and plenty of possums. 34 hectares contains a number of very good trees, notable trees, Kaikatea, Kauri, Rurua, Totra, and it has a Kauri hard beach area which is reasonably rare. There's one main creek that comes out through this area. The wetland is surrounded by most of this mature native bush. There's a 3 hectare flat area which has clusters of mature and younger trees, Kaikatea, Totra, Kanuka, along with rushgrass and rushes. Quite a lot of that is fenced, about 2 k's of it, which has protected the bush for about 40 years. And there's a reasonable amount of regeneration, but the fences are not boundary standard. About half k is not fenced. The back boundary is with the RAC now, is boundary fence standard. That's recently been put up. We have a water wheel for water for the stock out of this little creek that comes out of the bush area, and we'd wish to retain that for use for stock. If this submission is accepted, we believe there would be no visual damage to the present scene. There would be development in the quality and quantity of both bush and wetland in regards to the trees, regeneration and bird habitat. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Cummings. So your property's, it's on Kiowa Road, isn't it? Which is the one that comes out on the main highway, or the old main highway with Mangatangi haulers. Have I got the right road? Am I?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. I know where you are. All right. Let's see if there's any questions for you, Ms. Gibb.
No, thank you.
Mr. Mark?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Can I just ask, have you had any discussion with council? I know you're supporting the rule, but have you had any discussion with council regarding what you want to do with this land? With the entitlement?
We have, as far as covenanting the land.
You've discussed covenanting with them?
Yeah, yes. Yeah. Discussed that.
Okay. But you'd be entitled to a title. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
With that, yeah, okay. but you haven't had that discussion yet. No.
Well, no.
That's okay. I've understood now. I'm clear enough. Thank you.
Mr. Cooney, anything from you?
No, thank you. Thank you very much for that.
No, and I don't think I have any questions. Thank you. It's pretty clear. So thank you for your... Mr. Marg, did I ask if you had any questions? I thought I did. And then I saw you still had your microphone on, so I thought I might have missed you. So thank you both very much for your submission. I think we understand clearly what it is you're seeking. So thank you for that.
Excuse me, we did have another submission as well.
Oh, in relation to the earthworks in the SNA area, is that right?
Yeah, but that's not coming up till November, is it? I don't think.
If you'd like to present it now to save you having to come back, that would be fine.
Okay, but there was one for a general lot rule.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There was another
No,
one.
by all means, sorry, please carry on.
Oh, okay. Our original submission asked for 22.4.1, asked for some amendment to the maximum lot size for flexibility of varied rural activities. But today, we are very comfortable with the land size being up to 1.6 hectares. Why are we submitting? We hope to meet the criteria for the one lot being available ex-Franklin County under the rural hearing general lot subdivision. We'd like to title the land around another house on the property. So in regard to the subdivision after 1997 on this property, the Cummingses purchased 800 acres in 1927, which the present 149 hectares is part of. 14 acres were subdivided to grow grapes in early 1980s. This is the only subdivision to have taken place in 93 years on this 149 hectares. Thank you. And I could just have a wee look for the, I don't know. Oh, they might go ahead. We'll just... The other submission, which we haven't really done much work on.
If you prefer to do it at another time, that's absolutely fine. There's no pressure for you to do it now.
Yeah, I would. Thank
No,
you.
that's okay. No problem whatsoever.
It's there.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Let's just see if there's any questions on that second one. I suspect there aren't.
Okay.
If the panel does have any questions, rather than me go around the room, if anyone's got a question to ask, feel free to ask it. Otherwise, it looks like not. Thank you both very much, and hopefully that didn't result in too much elevated blood pressure.
Yeah, anxiety.
Hopefully not. Thank you very much.
Thank you people very much.
Brings us to D&K Miles, please.
Can you hear me?
Can now. Thank you. Sorry,
Hi.
we couldn't before. Now we can.
Okay. Okay. Can you see me?
Yes. Yes,
Yep.
we can.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Miles. I put a submission in back on the 5th of October 2018, which was nearly 2 years ago. And at that stage, I didn't even know about the BP and McDonald's and the other food outlets at Taupri that were, as I understand, it was rural land, but with a private land change, got changed. But for our block of land, we have 48.79 hectares on the Goddington Road. Property number is 2018140. I put a submission in that we oppose the 1997 threshold date for subdivision. We were wanting for further growth opportunities in our community and to shape the future of our district. And we feel that there would be minor effects, at any at all, if a little subdivision for maybe 1 or 2 lots, I don't want a big subdivision, 1 or maybe 2 lots, were allowed on our property, which in fact would generate more revenue for the council, e.g. rates. The rubbish and recycling is already happening, as it would be passing. Part of our land, we have a little parcel of land which is 0.3 hectares, which is about 3/4 of an acre, and it's not attached to our main land. We have to cross the road at Redbrook if we want to put cattle on there, and it ends at the end of the golf course. So it's not actually attached to our land, but it's part of our title. This is a pretty much useless pocket of parcel of land. And when I was questioning council, I asked staff and they said they weren't sure how this little pocket of land happened to be like that. So yeah, so just wondering to see if it would be more beneficial if we were allowed to have this pocket of land with its own little bit of own title to allow someone to have housing and accommodation there. The demand for small rural little sections is we believe is there, and a good quality of life for someone in the community. Yeah, I'm not sure what else I need to tell or say.
No, I think we understand the point that you're making. Am I right in thinking, I've just been looking exactly where your property is, you're just on the Topiti side of the golf course, is that right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Can you see the little pocket of land? It's numbered U. And,
yes, I can see it on Google Earth.
Yeah, and it's not attached to anything. We have to put cattle across the road if you want to put anything on there.
Okay, no, I understand, thank you. Let's see if there's any questions. I think what you've sought and what you're asking for is pretty clear to us, but let's see if there's any questions. Mr. Fulton?
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I don't have any questions, thank you.
Is it good?
No questions, but as it's a standalone title, can it not have a house built on it as it is?
No.
Is that right? Yeah, Mrs. Miles, yeah.
No, it's not a standalone title. It's part of my one title. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, attached.
Oh, that is unusual, isn't it? Okay, we'll have to take that into consideration. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mark?
This may be a dumb question, but was it that way ever since you've owned the property, or did the road cause the problem?
No, we bought the property in 2017 and the title was done in 2009. So back in 2009, that piece of land, pocket of land, is part of our title. Yeah. And
originally, I guess when you bought it, you were thinking you were getting this great big piece, and then you find out you got this little tiny piece across the road.
Yeah.
Very good, very good.
Thanks, Mr. Mark. Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
No, and I don't have any questions either. Thank you very much, but that's clear enough. Thanks for your submission.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Next is the Hopkins family, represented by Birch Surveyors. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Sir William. How are the book sales going?
They're pretty good, actually. Would you like one?
I saw your smiling face when I went into Whitcoulls, but I did resist the temptation to buy one at the time.
Oh, it was great value.
I'm sure it was. All right. Sorry, just we've got your statement and your summary, so we're just in your hands. Thank you.
Yes, I'll just summarise really what's been in our
yes, please.
Submission and our rebuttal submission. I guess the issue for us is that the Hines submission draws substantially on the fact that the operative district plan provides for a buffer around the aggregate extraction zone, and that disappearing largely with the with the proposed plan than the buffer zone is. And so they're trying to recreate a buffer well outside of their land holdings. And I think to summarise the concern of the Hopkins family, and I've got to say about 10 other property owners who have subsequently written to us, and we've sent those letters in as well, all living along Bluff Road, is that Pokeno today is a different community to that proposed when the land on the Hind, on which Hinds is located, was zoned for heavy industrial development under the operative district plan. Then it was really a small rural community on the crossroads of the Waikato and Auckland and the Bay of Plenty. Today it's a rapidly growing community of a substantial size with a significant population growth forecast, and that's stretching the boundaries of Pokeno as we used to know it. And part of that extension is towards the banks of the Waikato River, and thus merging with the old historic town of Havelock, which was subdivided and laid out as a village in the 1880s, but which quite a lot of people live in that part of Pokeno, which is separated from the town. And to get there, you've got to go onto the motorway off Pioneer Road, which is a very bad entrance to the motorway, and then come off at the off-ramp. Now, Hinds have established their large pipe manufacturing business on 22.412 hectares and have room for substantial expansion of their production. They occupy about 1/3 of the property today. And in addition to that, Hinds have purchased and now own 2 further properties. And I haven't submitted the plan of those, but it has been submitted with the Hinds evidence showing their additional purchases. So today they own 62 Bluff Road, which comprises 27.4 hectares, and the adjoining property at 10 Bluff Road, which is another 9.46 hectares, giving them a total land area of very nearly 60 hectares, 59.28 hectares. Now, the proposal by Hinds to establish a buffer zone that would substantially compromise the future development of 10 small land holdings on Bluff Road or Pioneer Road, including that of our clients, the Hopkins family, it really cannot be justified in their view and in our view. And I understand from the 42A report prepared by Jonathan Cleese that on his base of his recommendation that this issue will be considered further by the panel at the residential zone extent next year. So we're not going to debate the technical aspects of it today, rather just to we wanted to rebut the assertions made by Hinds in their submissions on this topic. So the proposal by Hinds to establish a buffer zone that would substantially compromise those 10 properties is of major concern to them. I mean, all of them have got dwellings on, and to further develop them, whether it's by way of growth of Pokeno, which is proposed. In the case of the Hopkins, they've submitted that their land be rezoned village zone. And a large part of it would be compromised if that buffer zone proceeded. So it's sufficient, therefore, at this hearing, for us to submit that Hinds have sufficient land to mitigate on their own land any adverse effect which might emanate from their industrial activities, either today or in the future. And we think that's where the answer lies, if indeed justified. It's quite interesting to note that in the Section 42A report by Jonathan Cleese, that the other large industrial sites in Waikato on the proposed plan, such as at Miri, at Horatu, and the Huntly Power Station, they do not have any buffer zones on the adjoining agricultural land or rural land. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the best guide, and Jonathan himself said, well, that's historic, but in our view, the principle that should be applied here, particularly given the amount of land that Hinds actually own and the relatively smaller amount of land they occupy, that the answer to mitigating or remediating any nuisances that they create lies in providing that mitigation on their own properties. So when we come to the issue later, we'll look at it from a more technical point of view and provide some evidence around this, but we wanted to simply to put up our hand on behalf of those, the Hopkins family and the other 9 residents in Bluff Road, whose properties would be severely compromised by the type of buffer that has been proposed by Hinds.
All right, thank you, Sir William. Let's see if we've got any questions for you. Mr. Fulton?
Perhaps not a question, but just a comment that we, as a hearings panel, have toured this area quite substantially, and we went down Bluff Road, down to the river and Pioneer Road and so on. So we're reasonably familiar with the area you're talking about, so it's familiar in our minds.
Thanks, Mr. Fulton. Ms. Gibb?
Yes, we did go there, and thank you for just highlighting this concern. Obviously, we'll be considering that, especially at a later hearing as well. Thank you.
Mr. Mark?
Nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Yes, and just to clarify, it's I think the word nuisance that you used, Sir William, might not represent the true picture there. It's the normal effects associated with the operation of heavy industry that Hinds is seeking to protect itself against complaints about. So that's the reason underpinning their quest for an extended buffer zone, which is nothing unusual about that.
I understand their concern. They want to protect their own interests.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, I don't think I have any questions. Thanks, Sir William. What you're seeking and the reasons for it are clear. And as the others have said, we'll hear more from you in due course when we get into this more specific forensic aspects.
Thanks a lot.
So thank you for your appearance today. That brings us, I think, to the end of our submitters for today. Is there anybody that's present that's expecting to speak today? That's good, because our understanding seems to concur with that of everybody else. So on that basis, we'll adjourn for the day, just noting that we're commencing tomorrow at 10 o'clock, not 9 o'clock, just so that people are aware of that. So we'll stand adjourned now until 10 tomorrow. Thank you all very much. And if the panel could just